The man who knew the future of America. In the winter of 1831, while most Americans were consumed with the price of cotton, westward expansion, and the fragile balance between free and slave states, a quiet foreigner stepped onto American soil with no intention of changing history. And yet, history would never see itself the same way again. His name was Alexis de Tocqueville. At the time, no one in New York Harbor noticed him. No newspapers announced his arrival. No politicians greeted him. No crowds gathered to hear his thoughts. He was just another young European aristocrat, pale from the Atlantic crossing, dressed modestly, carrying notebooks instead of ambitions. To the dock workers and customs officers, he was unremarkable. But Tocqueville had already seen something that Americans themselves could not yet see. And what he would write, quietly, patiently, almost invisibly, would become one of the most accurate prophecies ever made about the future of the United States. Not a prophecy spoken like a mystic, not a prediction shouted like a revolutionary, but a warning written like a mirror. Alexis de Tocqueville was born in 1805 into a French aristocratic family still haunted by the guillotine. His grandparents had narrowly escaped execution during the French Revolution, and that shadow followed him throughout his youth. France, in his lifetime, had already known monarchy, revolution, empire, collapse, restoration, and rebellion again. Power rose and fell like a tide that crushed anyone standing too still. From an early age, Tocqueville became obsessed with a single question. Why do some societies fall into tyranny while others seem to resist it, even while claiming freedom? France had declared liberty and drowned itself in blood. Kings fell, emperors rose, and ordinary people suffered no matter which flag flew overhead. Tocqueville did not trust slogans. He wanted systems, structures, patterns. And across the ocean, there was a strange experiment unfolding, one that fascinated Europe: America. To Europeans, the United States was a paradox, a nation without kings, without ancient nobility, without a state religion, yet somehow stable. Its citizens elected leaders without constant revolutions. Its economy grew without a centralized aristocracy. Its people spoke endlessly about freedom, yet obeyed laws more willingly than most Europeans. To Tocqueville, America was not a success story. It was a case study. Officially, Tocqueville traveled to America to study prison reform. That was the excuse given to the French government to fund his journey. Unofficially, he had a far more dangerous goal: to dissect democracy itself, to understand its strengths, its seductions, and its hidden poisons. He arrived at a time when America was still fragile. Andrew Jackson was president, a populist hero to many and a terrifying demagogue to others. Native American nations were being forcibly removed from their land under the Indian Removal Act. Slavery was expanding westward, even as moral opposition grew stronger in the North. Newspapers were partisan weapons. Churches competed for souls. Expansion felt inevitable. And Tocqueville began to observe. Not as a tourist, not as a fan, but as a surgeon. He traveled thousands of miles by riverboat, horseback, carriage, through cities and frontier towns. He spoke with judges, farmers, lawyers, prisoners, ministers, politicians, merchants, and slaves. He watched town hall meetings. He listened to sermons. He read local newspapers obsessively. And slowly, something unsettling became clear. America's greatest strength was also its greatest danger. Unlike Europe, America had no inherited aristocracy. Status came not from blood, but from money, reputation, and public opinion. On the surface, this seemed like freedom, but Tocqueville noticed something deeper. Equality, when taken too far, did not eliminate hierarchy, it changed its shape. In Europe, people bowed to kings. In America, Tocqueville realized, people bowed to the majority. This terrified him. In France, tyranny wore a crown. In America, tyranny could wear a smile. He watched juries carefully. They were celebrated as symbols of democracy, ordinary citizens judging their peers. But Tocqueville saw more than civic participation. He saw conformity being trained. Citizens learned not only how to judge, but how to think like the majority. Public opinion was everywhere. In churches, in newspapers, in taverns, in polite conversation. And it punished dissent not with prison, but with isolation. A man who disagreed with the majority in America was not executed, he was not jailed, he was ignored, socially erased, economically sidelined, laughed at, considered untrustworthy. To Tocqueville, this was more powerful than violence, because fear of death hardens resistance, fear of isolation dissolves it. He wrote in his notebook that America had discovered something new in human history, a tyranny that leaves the body free but enslaves the soul. Yet Tocqueville was not hostile to America, quite the opposite. He admired its energy, its civic institutions, its local governance. He was fascinated by how small towns governed themselves, how citizens volunteered for public life, how associations formed naturally, from churches to charities to political clubs. These voluntary associations, he believed, were America's secret weapon. They prevented the state from becoming all-powerful. They taught citizens cooperation. They created a buffer between the individual and authority. But even here, Tocqueville sensed fragility. What happens, he wondered, when people stop participating? What happens when comfort replaces civic duty? What happens when citizens grow tired of complexity and ask the government to simplify life for them? That question haunted him. He saw Americans obsessed with material success, not wealth alone, but constant improvement, bigger farms, faster transport, more land, more production, more convenience. This hunger drove progress, but it also created restlessness. Tocqueville feared that one day Americans might trade freedom for comfort, not because a tyrant demanded it, but because they requested it. And if that day came, democracy would not collapse in a coup. It would dissolve quietly. One of Tocqueville's most disturbing observations came from studying slavery. America called itself the land of liberty, yet millions were enslaved. But Tocqueville's insight went beyond moral condemnation. He realized that slavery was not only a crime against Black Americans, it was a poison in the bloodstream of democracy itself. In the South, slavery destroyed the dignity of labor. Poor white citizens, instead of working, were taught to despise work. Power concentrated in the hands of a few plantation elites. Inequality deepened. In the North, Tocqueville saw something different but equally dangerous: racial prejudice without legal slavery. Free Black citizens were excluded, segregated, humiliated. He predicted, decades before the Civil War, that slavery would tear the nation apart. But more chillingly, he warns that even after slavery ended, its legacy would remain, embedded in institutions, habits, and fears. America, he wrote, would struggle with race long before chains were broken, not because of laws, but because of memory. Tocqueville returned to France in 1832, carrying crates of notes. Over the next several years, he transformed those notes into a book that would quietly alter political thought forever: Democracy in America. It was not a celebration. It was not an attack. It was a diagnosis. When the first volume was published in 1835, it shocked Europe. Here was a young aristocrat explaining why democracy worked in America and why it might eventually fail if Americans misunderstood their own system. He predicted that America would become a global power, not through conquest, but through influence. Its ideas would travel faster than its armies. He predicted the rise of centralized bureaucracy, not as a dictatorship, but as a caring, administrative state that would slowly absorb responsibility from citizens. He predicted political polarization, where parties would appeal not to reason, but to emotion and identity. He predicted a future where citizens, overwhelmed by complexity, would withdraw into private life, leaving public power to professionals and demagogues. Most terrifying of all, he predicted